The colony was called Veth's Landing, and it had been dead for 11 years. Sergeant Mal Varro knew exactly how long because he'd been the one to file the evacuation order on a handheld terminal while standing knee-deep in ash, watching the last shuttle lift away from a sky that was the color of a bruise. He'd been 26 then. He was 37 now, and he was standing in the same ash. Only this time the sky was clear, and the ruins were quieter, and he was alone. Not entirely alone. "You're still there," he said without turning around. The figure behind him shifted. He heard the crunch of brittle ruin glass underfoot. "I'm not following you," a voice said. It was young, female. The kind of voice that had been raised on something harder than ease and had gotten careful about showing it. "I'm just going the same direction." "There's nothing in that direction," Mal said. "I've been this direction for 2 days." "I know," she said. "I've been watching you for 2 of them." He turned around then. She was maybe 20 years old, maybe less, maybe more. She had the build of someone who'd grown up running from things and hadn't stopped, long-limbed and tightly controlled, with the kind of stillness that isn't peace but endurance. Her coat was too big for her. Someone else's coat, clearly. She wore it like she'd taken it off someone in a hurry and had forgotten to feel anything about that. Her eyes were the color of deep water at the edge of light, and she was watching him with an expression he'd seen before on scouts who'd been in the field 3 days longer than the extraction window. Someone who's been keeping it together on will alone and is starting to calculate how much will she has left. She was wearing boots that were the right size, which told him she'd planned the rest of her escape even when she hadn't planned everything else. Her hands were calloused in the specific pattern of someone who'd handled equipment regularly, not military equipment, something lighter, more precise. Survey tools, maybe, or medical. Her hair was cut in a way that suggested she'd done it herself with a field knife sometime in the last 2 weeks. She had a small scar at the corner of her left eye that was old enough to be finished healing, but new enough that she hadn't stopped noticing it yet. He could tell by the way she didn't touch it, the deliberate not touching of someone consciously breaking a habit. "You're one of the survivors," Mal said, not a question. She didn't answer immediately. "Survivors of what?" she said. "Veth's Landing, the 3rd settlement cluster, North Quadrant. I'm guessing by your accent and the scar on your left forearm." He paused. "And the fact that you're wearing Sergeant Clara Sorn's coat." Something moved across her face. It went in and came out again before he could name it. "That's my mother's coat," she said. Mal was quiet for a moment. He'd known Clara Sorn not well. The way you know people on frontier stations, by proximity and by what they never talked about. She'd been a good soldier once and a mediocre administrator after, which was common, and she'd raised her daughter out here on the edge of fold space for reasons she'd never fully explained. He remembered her at the administrative terminal in the North Station, doing the careful, accurate work of someone who'd chosen a small life deliberately. He remembered her hands. They'd looked like her daughter's hands. He pulled off his own jacket. It was the old kind coalition surplus from 2 wars back, faded olive gray, no insignia because those had been stripped in the field. It smelled like engine oil and synthetic coffee and 12 years of not quite going home. He held it out. "Your coat's not warm enough," he said. "Take it." She stared at the jacket. She stared at him. The calculation in her eyes shifted slightly. "I don't need. I've got a thermal liner under this. You don't." He shook the jacket once impatiently. "Take it." She took it. She didn't thank him. She just pulled it on over her mother's coat, and something about the double-layered absurdity of it, the thin dead woman's coat under the battered soldier's jacket, made his chest feel like old metal under a new load. Her name was Taya Sorn. She told him that 3 minutes later when they were walking, and he'd asked directly. He told her his name. She said, "I know who you are. You filed the evac order for Veth's Landing. You're the reason my mother left." He didn't tell her that her mother had refused to leave for 6 additional hours, and that those 6 hours were the reason Clara Sorn had made it onto the last shuttle at all. Some things you give people as a gift. Some things you hold back the same way. They walked. The colony had been beautiful once, after the manner of frontier things that don't know they're meant to be temporary. The biodomes were down now, but you could see where they'd been from the patterns in the soil, the ghost strings of cultivation. Where the main settlement cluster had been, there was now a particular quality of silence that had nothing to do with sound. It was the silence of absent routine, of morning schedules that would never run again, of the specific emptiness a place holds when the people who named it are gone. Mal had spent enough time in enough ruined places that he'd stopped finding them tragic, which he suspected said something about him. But walking through Veth's Landing now, he felt the tragedy again. Small and specific. The way a particular shape of ruin can be worse than a general one. He'd come here for operational reasons. There was a buried relay station in the North Quadrant that was still live, technically, because nobody'd gotten around to officially decommissioning it, and he had been sent to retrieve a data cache from it before the Coalition shut the whole zone down. The mission was administrative in a way that missions sometimes were at the end of their natural life. The last bureaucratic gesture towards something that had stopped mattering in practical terms. He'd expected a dead colony and a silent job and 2 days of ash. He hadn't expected the girl. He hadn't expected what was inside her pocket. She told him about it on the second night, after they'd made camp in the shell of what had once been a community hall. The roof was gone, but the walls still held, and Mal had a field burner and enough ration packs to last another 3 days. And she'd watched him heat food with the focused attention of someone who hadn't eaten properly in longer than she wanted to admit before he handed her a pack without making a production of it. She ate the whole thing in under 2 minutes and didn't comment on that, and he didn't either. "There's something I need to tell you," she said. Mal said nothing. He was good at silence. It was one of the skills you developed when you'd spent enough years in the field, the ability to hold a silence like a door held open, a space into which someone could walk if they chose to, or turn away from if they didn't. Most people turned away the first time and came back after they'd decided. He waited. She came back after about 30 seconds. "My mother left me something," Taya said, "when she died." She reached into the interior pocket of Cleara's coat. She pulled out a small object and held it up. It was a military ID chip. Coalition standard, older model, the kind they'd used in the early expansion wars. The kind that had been replaced by biometric encoding 40 years ago and weren't carried anymore except as keepsakes. This one was worn smooth on one edge from being held. The wear pattern wasn't random. It was concentrated in the specific spot where a thumb rested when a hand closed around it. Someone had held this the same way, over and over, for a very long time. She used to hold it when she was worried, Taya said. I watched her for years. I thought it was her service chip, just her service record. It's not, Mal said. He wasn't sure how he knew. He said, is it? No, Taya turned the chip in her fingers. I ran it through a field reader 3 months ago, by accident. I was cleaning out her things and I had my reader out for something else and I touched it to the chip and it didn't read her service record. It read, she paused. It read a targeting sequence, a very old targeting sequence, for something called the Onigashima Protocol. Mal had been in the Coalition for 16 years. He'd served in 3 wars, 4 suppression campaigns, and more field operations than he could accurately count. He had the kind of operational memory that cataloged most things automatically, and only flagged the ones that mattered. The Onigashima Protocol mattered. It mattered in the way that things matter when you've heard the name exactly once. In a classified briefing, you were only half supposed to be in, and the officer giving the briefing paused before saying the words as if she was calculating the cost of saying them at all. It mattered in the way that a quiet name in a loud room matters, because the quiet is wrong, because someone made it quiet deliberately, because what's behind the name is the kind of thing that requires a door closed over it. Where did your mother get that chip? He said. I don't know, Taya said. But I know who's looking for it. She'd run for 3 months before ending up here. That was the summary. The details were longer and harder, and she compressed them the way people compress things when the weight of them is too much to carry at full scale. 3 months of fold space transit, 3 months of changing ships and names, and never staying long enough to leave a heat signature in any database. She'd used skills she'd learned from her mother: navigation, field reading, the specific administrative invisibility of someone who'd been trained to process transit records, and therefore knew how transit records could be avoided. She'd watched 2 people who'd helped her disappear. She'd learned to stop asking for help, and to stop leaving people in positions where helping her was an option they might choose, because the people who chose it paid for it. She was telling him now only because she'd spent 2 days watching him walk alone through this ash field, and she'd made a calculation she wasn't entirely sure about. He was coalition, which was a reason not to trust him. Her mother's chip was something the coalition's own compromised channels had already lost twice. But he was here alone, walking for no reason she'd been able to identify on the first day, and he hadn't filed anything on his handheld since she'd started watching, which meant he wasn't reporting regularly, which was unusual for an active service soldier. She'd decided he was either very capable or very far off the reservation. Both were more useful than a standard line soldier. "The ones following you," Mal said. "What are they?" "Gorvathi," she said. He went quiet for a different kind of reason now. Gorvathi were old. That was the first and most important thing. They were old the way deep space things are old, in ways that registered differently than the human frame of reference for time. The coalition had encountered them twice. Both times had been bad. Not bad in the way that a battle with losses is bad, but bad in the way that encounters with the genuinely different are bad. When the operating assumptions you've built your strategy around simply don't apply, and you lose time and people and ground discovering that before you can begin to adapt. They fought with the calm of things that did not believe they could lose, which was worse than fanaticism, because it was based on a longer evidence set. They were tall and angular and moved like calculations made physical, efficient, unhurried, absolute. Their military hierarchy was built around familial lineages the coalition linguists called Oni chains, and at the top of each chain was an Oni lord who held the power of the chain's full combat capacity like a closed fist. They dressed for war the way certain ancient human cultures had dressed for ceremony, which was the same thing to them: robes over their war frames, marking in visible language what they were and what they were owed. "Which Oni chain?" Mal said. "The Galadra line," Taya said. "There are 2 of them, brothers, Kulrak and Shevrak." He'd heard those names too. Most frontier soldiers had. The Galadra brothers had been responsible for the fall of 3 human outposts in fold-adjacent space over the past decade, and nobody had been able to figure out how they were doing it because they were using a method that didn't match anything in the coalition's strategic catalog. They weren't attacking along standard tactical approaches. They were arriving, as if they'd been somewhere else entirely a moment before, and had simply chosen to be at the target instead. Fold space transiting, his briefings had said, highly sophisticated, unknown mechanism. He looked at the chip in Taya's hand. Unknown mechanism, requiring an activation key. "Your mother knew what this was," he said. Taya's jaw tightened slightly. "Yes." "And she never told you." "She left it to me when she died." Taya's voice was precisely neutral, which meant it was carrying more than it was showing. "She didn't tell me what it was. She left it, and she left a note. In her handwriting, it said, 'Taya, keep this from the ones who look like ceremony.' That's all. Keep this from the ones who look like ceremony." Mal turned that over. Ceremony, ritual, hierarchical performance. The Gorvathi Oni lords dressed for engagement the way ancient militaries had dressed for formal execution, not in combat armor, but in something older and more deliberate, robes over their war frames, marking their status as something beyond soldiers. something that had been promised a specific kind of victory and intended to collect. Cleara had known. She'd known exactly what the Gorvathi looked like when they came for what they believed they were owed. And she'd warned her daughter in the only language that mattered in the field, what they look like when you see them. "How long do you think you have before they track you to Veth's Landing?" Mal asked. "Maybe a day," Taya said, "maybe less." Mal looked around the shell of the community hall. He thought about Cleara Sorn, who had held a chip for decades without telling anyone what it was, who had stayed at her administrative terminal and done her quiet work and raised her daughter at the edge of the known, and let none of it show. He thought about what kind of person does that, and what kind of weight they carry doing it, and whether the weight of it was why she'd looked tired in a way he'd always attributed to the frontier. He thought about the relay station in the North Quadrant, still live, still technically broadcasting, and about the data cache he'd been sent to retrieve, and about the off-roster frequency he'd been given once and told to use in specific circumstances. "Get some sleep," he said. "I'll take watch." She started to object. He looked at her, the full look, the one that wasn't asking. She slept. He used the 3 hours she was out to reach the relay station and do what needed doing. The Gorvathi arrived at dawn. There were 12 of them on the ground, the Gelnut soldiers, they were called, the Grunt-class fighters of the Galadra line. They came in low from the west, and Mal saw them before they saw him because he'd been on watch, and because the ash field outside the community hall had a particular silence that changed quality when weight moved through it, the same way water changes when something slides through it from underneath. He felt the change before he understood it, and that half-second of instinct was what made the difference. He woke Taya with one hand on her shoulder and a single finger to his lips. She understood immediately. No questions, no hesitation. She was on her feet in 3 seconds with her pack in her hand, which told him she'd been sleeping ready, which told him she'd been doing this for long enough that ready was just how she slept now. They moved through the community hall's east wall, through a gap he'd already identified and already noted, and they ran, not panicked, tactical, for the biodome skeleton cluster 300 meters north. He'd scoped it the day before. Old industrial habit. You don't trust a space you haven't mapped, even the spaces you think you're leaving. The Gelnut soldiers weren't slow, but they were methodical. They checked corners, they swept in patterns. They didn't rush because they didn't believe they needed to. They'd come for a piece of property and a key, and they brought the patience of the inevitable, the patience of things that have never had to feel urgency because the universe has consistently confirmed their arrival. Mal used that patience against them. There was a drainage basin 30 meters inside the biodome cluster, deep enough to conceal 2 people prone, and they went into it without discussion. The basin smelled like old irrigation water and mineral residue from the colony's agriculture operation. 11 years of weather had crusted the sides in white sediment. Mal went in first, and Taya followed, and they lay flat, and he watched the Gelnuts move through the cluster, through the gap, between the basin's rim and the ash above. Above the lip of the basin, the Gelnuts moved in their methodical pattern. They communicated in low tonal bursts that his field translator captured as something between military code and liturgical response. Calling and answering, marking sectors clear. The call and response of a unit that has worked together long enough that the communication is more ritual than practical. "What do they want?" Taya whispered. Mal said, "The chip." "They've always wanted the chip," she said. 3 months and they've never tried to talk, just take. "They don't negotiate," he said. "That's doctrine." The Galadra line specifically, they consider communication an acknowledgement of peer status. They don't acknowledge peers. "Then how do we?" "We don't, not with them." He paused. "We wait." Taya was quiet for a moment. Then she said something he hadn't expected. "Then how did my mother get the chip in the first place?" He went very still. He hadn't thought about that. He should have. He'd been thinking about the chip as a target, as an object being pursued, and he'd started from the wrong end of the timeline. He'd been tracking 30 years forward from Cleara's possession of the thing rather than 30 years back from whatever moment she'd come to have it. Cleara Sorn, Sergeant, Frontier Administration, mediocre politician, good soldier once. And before the frontier, before Veth's Landing, she'd been something he didn't actually know. Keep this from the ones who look like Ceremony, as if she'd met Ceremony before and knew what it looked like. The Gelnoots didn't find them in the basin. 3 of them came within 8 meters, and Mal went flat and made himself part of the geology, and Taya did the same, and they lay in the gravel and the mineral crust with their faces turned and waited, and the patrol moved on. They got out at noon, after the Gelnoot sweep had moved another sector north, and by late afternoon they'd reached the relay station. It was buried under the old North Quadrant maintenance depot, hatch in the floor, ladder down, a small subterranean room with humming equipment, and the particular smell of spaces that have been sealed and maintained for years with no human inside them. It was the smell of machinery more loyal than the people who'd built it, still waiting, still running. He pulled up a communication line on the old terminal. He sent a message. Not to Coalition Command, not through standard channels. He sent it to a specific name on a specific off-roster frequency that he'd been given once during a briefing he wasn't supposed to have been in, with instructions that it was to be used only in the event of something specific. He'd carried the frequency in his memory for 9 years and used it 0 times. He was fairly sure this qualified as the event. "What are you doing?" Taya asked, watching over his shoulder. "Calling a train," Mal said, which made no literal sense and enough metaphorical sense that she didn't ask again. The response came in 90 minutes. Not a message, a physical response. Above the relay station hatch, in the ash field of Veth's Landing, something arrived that had not been there before. A coalition vessel of a class he'd seen once in a sealed archive. A deep fold runner that moved through fold-adjacent space with the particular quality of motion that meant it wasn't following the standard transit protocols. It settled without sound in the ash, and the sound it didn't make was somehow louder than the sound it should have, because the absence of noise from something that size was wrong in a way the body recognized before the mind did. Its hatch opened, and a figure in old Coalition Command colors stood in the opening. Not a soldier, an administrator, old. The kind of old that means she'd been old longer than most people were anything, not decrepit, but settled into age the way certain mountains are settled into their ground, with a quality of having outlasted things that were supposed to outlast her. She looked at Taya Sorn with the expression of someone recognizing something they'd been tracking from a very long distance. "Her mother's daughter," the station master said. "I hoped it would be." They were aboard the runner within the hour. Taya sat in the small galley compartment with her hands around a heated mug and listened to the station master lay it out. The Onigashima Protocol was not a weapon in the standard sense. It was an old word for an older thing. 3 centuries back, in the earliest days of human deep space expansion, the Coalition had encountered a Gorvathi installation in Fold space, an unmanned station, or so they'd thought. What they'd actually found was a Gorvathi dreadnought in a dormancy cycle, an ancient warship of the Oni class, a vessel so large it had been mistaken for an asteroid on the initial surveys. The survey team had logged it as a geological formation and moved on, and it had taken one member of that team to look at the geometry of the thing, the wrong kind of geometry, the kind that suggested intention rather than geology, and understand what they were looking at. That member had been a woman named Shan, who was Cleara Sorn's mother and Taya's grandmother, and she'd pulled the trump node from the dreadnought's exterior activation port before the survey team had finished cataloging it. She'd told no one. She'd filed the station as geological. She'd carried the chip back through 3 transit points and a decontamination corridor, and 7 bureaucratic checkpoints. And then she'd spent the rest of her life deciding what to do with it and running out of time before she decided. "Your grandmother took it," the station master said. "She was part of the survey team. She understood what it was before anyone else did. She removed it from the installation before the Gorvathi woke. She died before she could hand it over to anyone she trusted, so she gave it to Cleara, who was 7 years old and didn't know what she was being given." Taya was quiet for a moment. Then she said, why didn't my mother turn it in? To the coalition, to someone." "She tried," the station master said. "3 times. Each time, whoever she turned it to either disappeared or was found to have been compromised by Gorvathi informants inside coalition administration." A pause. The old woman held her own mug without drinking from it, the gesture of someone who'd made tea as a ritual comfort for so long that the making was more important than the drinking. "The Galadra brothers are patient, as the Gorvathi tend to be. They've been hunting that chip for 30 years. They've had a great deal of time to build their network inside the systems they need to infiltrate." "Who else knows about the dreadnought?" Mal said from the back of the compartment. "More than should, fewer than you'd hope." The station master turned to look at him with the careful assessment she'd been giving everything since she'd arrived. "The dreadnought's capabilities are documented in 3 sealed archives, 2 of which have been accessed in the last 5 years by people who subsequently retired early and took up residence in locations the coalition doesn't officially monitor." "So who isn't compromised?" Mal said. "Us," she said. "This vessel, and whatever we can put together in the next 14 hours, because that's approximately how long we have before Kulrak and Shevrak arrive in Veth's Landing. Find the colony empty, track the runner's fold signature, and follow us here." "Where's here?" Taya asked. "The junction," the old woman said, "between now and then." Mal didn't like plans he didn't understand. But he'd worked with the station master twice before in operations that had no official existence, and he'd learned that she operated in a different mode than anything the coalition had formally trained him for. She worked in information, in positioning, in the deliberate arrangement of what people believed to be true. She was, he'd once thought, a woman who'd spent her life building stages and watching the right things perform on them. He did not entirely like what she proposed. He liked the alternatives less. The plan was this: the runner would present itself to the Galadra dreadnought as a surrendering party. The station master would act as coalition representative. She would offer the trump node and the runner itself as a gesture of capitulation, the kind of formal submission that Gorvathi Oni doctrine required from defeated parties, not a negotiation, but a ritual of acknowledgement. The Gorvathi Galadra line would board the runner to receive the formal surrender, because the Galadra line didn't do anything without ceremony. That was their doctrine, their pride, and their blind spot. And while they were aboard performing their ritual of acceptance, the people they thought they'd captured would not be where they appeared to be. The station master, accepting surrender, would be the runner's primary navigation AI, running the old woman's coat and voice pattern mimicry, because the station master had anticipated something like this for long enough that she'd prepared for it years ago. The AI could hold a voice pattern and a posture indefinitely. It would not hold up under close scrutiny, but Gorvathi Oni lords didn't scrutinize. They received. Scrutiny implied doubt, and doubt implied the possibility of being wrong. The real station master would be elsewhere. The real trump node would be elsewhere. And the Onigashima dreadnought, dormant in fold space with its activation sequence in enemy hands, would find those hands occupied with a stage set that looked like victory, while the people who actually understood what the chip could do found their way to the dreadnought's core. "You want to sink it from the inside," Mal said. "I want to end it," the station master said. "It's a 500-year-old superweapon that has been used as leverage over 3 human systems for a decade. The only truly safe solution is to remove it from existence." "From inside," he said. It's the only angle they've never defended, she said. They've never had to. No one's ever been inside while the dreadnought was active. The Gorvathi are very confident of their perimeter security. He thought about Veth's landing in the morning, empty and ash-gray. He thought about the 3 outposts the Galadra brothers had taken. He thought about the way they arrived, using the dreadnought's fold mechanism, the thing they'd been refining for 5 centuries, the thing that made them appear at targets without warning. He thought about 2 brothers who'd chased a chip across 30 years of human space, who'd compromised coalition administrators and disappeared frontier soldiers, and pursued a single inheritance through 3 generations of one family. "All right," he said. It came out sounding more like Taya than he intended. Taya liked the plan immediately. She sat forward while the station master explained it and asked 3 questions, good questions, operational questions, the kind that identified the load-bearing points in a structure and checked whether they'd hold. She got answers she considered acceptable and then said, "All right," in a tone that committed fully and without visible hesitation. He watched that, the way she went from listening to deciding without dwelling in the space between them. That was something you either had or you learned, and the people who learned it usually learned it in conditions you didn't wish on anyone. The Gorvathi found them 8 hours later. Not through the fold signature, as predicted. Through a tracking signal in the trump node itself, which the station master had not known about, which meant that the 14-hour window became 0 without warning, because the most dangerous kind of no time is the kind you expected to have. The Onigashima dreadnought appeared in fold space around them like a weather event. One moment there was the dark of deep space outside the runner's viewports. Then there was hull, gray-white Gorvathi metal, older than any human construction Mal had ever seen, enormous in a way that the brain processes as landscape rather than object. It displaced the visual field entirely. It was like being inside a canyon that had chosen to form around you, and the canyon had been built by something that had been thinking about this specific canyon for 500 years. The scale of it was wrong. Not wrong in the way that big things are wrong when you don't expect them, but wrong in the way that things are wrong when their size implies a kind of patience you haven't allowed yourself to believe in. Someone had wanted to build this so badly that they'd spent half a millennium doing it. Mal had 3 seconds to feel appropriately small about that before his training reasserted itself. "They'll board through the standard contact protocol," the station master said, very calm. She had the particular calm of someone who'd been expecting something like this long enough that its arrival was less shock than completion. "They won't destroy us first. They want the chip intact, and they want the formal acknowledgement of surrender. That's the Galadra doctrine." "How long does the boarding protocol take?" Taya asked. 11 minutes, the old woman said, "from contact lock to interior entry." 11 minutes. Taya looked at Mal, he looked at her. She had his jacket on over her mother's coat. She'd been wearing it for 2 days. It had stopped being a gesture sometime in the last 48 hours and had become something else. Some other category that didn't have a clean name in the operational vocabulary, and neither of them had tried to name it. "I know what the trump node does to the dreadnought's core," she said. "I read the targeting sequence. I understand how it works." He knew what she was going to say before she said it. "No," he said. "I'm the only one who can read the full sequence," she said. "The station master confirmed that. It's biometrically keyed to my grandmother's bloodline. It reads on her descendants only. Then we find another way." "There isn't time for another way," Taya said, with the flat patience of someone who had done the math and was not interested in watching someone else do it slower. "You know there isn't." Mal looked at her. She was 20 years old and she was wearing a dead woman's coat and a borrowed jacket, and she was standing in the middle of an impossible situation with the same expression he'd seen on the best soldiers he'd ever served with, not unafraid, but refusing to let the fear run faster than the calculation. She wasn't performing bravery. She was just ahead of the fear by enough of a margin to keep moving. "Tell me the sequence," he said. "I'll read it." "The chip won't activate for you. I told you." "Tell me the sequence anyway, as a backup." He held her eyes. "Humor me." She told him the sequence. He memorized it the way he memorized things in the field, not by repetition but by meaning, by building a story around the steps so they became inevitable rather than arbitrary. Old trick. Taught to him by a sergeant who'd been taught by her sergeant, and so on back into the operational past. An inheritance of method passed from person to person through the years of a profession. The boarding protocol began. The deception ran exactly as planned for 9 of the 11 minutes. The navigation AI held the station master's voice and posture with uncanny precision, the particular set of the shoulders, the specific rhythm of the old woman's speech, the pauses she took before certain words. Kulrak, the elder Galadra brother, taller than Shevrak, with the particular stillness of a predator that stopped believing anything can surprise it, stood in the runner's main compartment and looked at the AI with the expression of a man receiving something he'd been owed. There was no triumph in his face, no satisfaction, only the settled completion of someone collecting a long-running debt. Shevrak, the younger brother, stood behind him, and he was looking at the wrong things. Not the AI, the corners, the exits, the details that didn't quite fit the expected pattern. He moved through the compartment with his attention fractionally ahead of his body, the habit of someone who'd been in enough staged situations that the staging had a smell he'd learned to detect. Mal had been watching Shevrak since the moment they'd boarded, from the access tunnel where he and Taya and the station master were waiting, watching through a micro-aperture in the hatch. He'd seen Shevrak look at the AI's shoes and frown. He pulled Taya's arm. They moved. Not enough time to reach the point they'd planned. Enough time to reach the fold access hatch on the runner's exterior, the emergency coupling hatch that allowed physical transit between vessels when aligned in fold space. This was the part that was not in any plan, that was improvised in the 7 seconds between Shevrak looking at a pair of shoes and the understanding of what that look meant. The Trump node opened the hatch. It opened it because the node was built to speak to Gorvathi systems, and the dreadnought had recognized it, had extended a kind of welcome the way ancient machines extend welcomes, not warm, not hostile, but specific, the welcome of a system responding to the key it was built to receive. The interior of the Onigashima dreadnought was 500 years of unmanned maintenance and 0 human habitation, and it felt like it. The corridors were built for Gorvathi frames, wide and low-ceilinged by human standards, lit by a bioluminescent compound that clung to the walls in something between architecture and organism. The light pulsed very slowly, not like a heartbeat. Like breathing, but breathing on a longer cycle than any human lung operated, the respiration of something that measured time in centuries. Mal had never been inside an alien warship before. He'd been briefed on Gorvathi installations in 2 classified sessions, and he'd read the reports from the encounters that had produced those briefings, and he thought he'd understood the scale of the difference. He hadn't. The difference between understanding a thing intellectually and standing inside it was the same distance as the difference between a map and the ground. He took 3 seconds to be genuinely, viscerally unsettled by the space around him, not afraid, but recalibrated before moving. The station master was with them. She knew the layout from the original survey records, 3-century-old schematics that she'd memorized because that was the kind of person she was. She moved through the dreadnought's corridors with the careful confidence of someone navigating from an old map, who's allowing for the possibility that some things have changed and tracking the changes as they appear. "Core is 7 levels down," she said. "And we have perhaps 4 minutes before they know we're not on the runner." They had 3. Shevrak's shout in Gorvathi, translated by Mal's field unit as something between betrayal and "they've run," rang through the dreadnought's corridors, and the ship's bioluminescent walls brightened suddenly, as if the ship itself had registered the alarm. Sound moved differently in here. It bounced at angles that weren't architectural in any human sense, as if the corridors had been shaped to carry certain frequencies with deliberate precision. They ran. The levels were accessed by Gorvathi gravity stairs. Not stairs in the human sense, more a series of calibrated pressure changes that the ship's field generators induced to allow transit between levels. The physics felt wrong in a way that was hard to articulate until Mal tried to run down them and discovered that the wrongness had a specific quality. The gravity wasn't uniform, it was graduated, and the graduation was tuned for a Gorvathi stride length and pace, not a human one. He stumbled twice. The station master barely slowed. Taya moved through them like she'd been briefed in advance, which she had, because she was the kind of person who listened to the briefing and filed the details under use when needed. Level 4 was where Shevrak caught them. He hadn't called for his soldiers. That was notable. He'd come alone, down through his own ship's levels, with the speed of someone who knows the physics here the way humans know staircases in the dark of childhood homes. He appeared at the base of the gravity shift to level 4, and he looked at them, and his expression, translated through his angular, alien face, through the specific architecture of Gorvathi features that had evolved to signal different things than human features signal, was something that Mal recognized after a moment as grief. Not rage, not calculation, grief. "The trump node," Shevrak said through Mal's translator. "Give it to me and you live. It's a simple exchange." "You destroy 3 human systems with it," the station master said. "I would complete what was promised," Shevrak said. "This is not ambition. This is a vow. The Galadra line made a promise to our ancestors 500 years ago that the dreadnought would fly, that it would do what it was made to do. A promise to the dead is not less binding than a promise to the living. It is more binding. The dead cannot release you from it." His eyes moved to Taya. "The girl's grandmother stole the activation key. We have been bound by its absence for 30 years. We are not monsters. We are owed." Taya said, "You killed 2 people who were helping me." Shevrak's expression did something complex. "I gave orders to retrieve the chip," he said. "I did not give orders to kill." Something in his voice suggested this was true in a way that troubled him. That there was a gap between the orders given and the outcome produced, and that he knew the gap existed and had been calculating what it meant. "The dreadnought doesn't have to be pointed at human systems," Mal said. He hadn't planned to say anything. He said it because it was true, and because the shape of the situation suddenly suggested something he hadn't calculated before. A fold space engine that size could power an entire sector's transit infrastructure. You could move 10,000 ships through fold space every year with a fraction of what this thing generates. You could open trade routes the Gorvathi have never had access to because they've never been able to transit the deep folds. The dreadnought was built as a weapon because that was what was needed when it was started. That was 500 years ago. Shevrak looked at him with an expression that Mal couldn't fully translate. "You want to negotiate," the Gorvathi said. "I want to tell you what you're standing in," Mal said. "Because I'm not sure anyone told you what a weapon this size costs the person who fires it. I'm not sure anyone ran that particular calculation in your war council." Shevrak was quiet. "How many ships do you have left?" Mal said. "The Galadra line. You've been hunting that chip for 30 years. You've been running on the edge of your resources for a decade. Your soldiers are good, but you don't have many of them. If you fire this weapon and coalition response comes, and it will come, full response, every ship we have, you won't survive it." "We knew that when we made the vow," Shevrak said. "A promise kept is worth the cost. My brother and I have known this for 30 years. "What about Kulrak?" Mal said. A pause, a very slight one. The kind of pause that happens when a question lands in a space the person has been carefully not looking at. Your brother has been chasing this for 30 years because of a promise made before he was born, Mal said. If you fire this weapon, Kulrak doesn't survive the response either. He doesn't get 30 more years. He doesn't get anything after. You're asking him to pay the cost of a vow he didn't make. The expression on Shevrak's face was the most comprehensibly human thing Mal had seen on an alien face in 16 years of service. It was the face of someone recalculating a cost they'd always said they were willing to pay, and discovering that willing to pay means something different when you're the one setting the price for someone else. Above them, through the dreadnought's hull, something shook. Kulrak had found out he was coming. Time, the station master said quietly. Shevrak made a decision. Mal watched him make it, the specific quality of stillness that precedes resolution, the moment a weight settles. He stepped sideways, one deliberate step, clearing the path to the gravity shift downward. You have until my brother reaches this level, Shevrak said. I will not help you, but I will not stop you. They went down. The core of the Onigashima dreadnought was the oldest room Mal had ever been in, which was a paradox since it had been built by no human hand and intended for no human purpose. But 5 centuries ago, something had built this room with a quality of intention that scale and technology and time hadn't erased. It was made to mean something. That came through the bioluminescent walls, which were brighter here, pulsing in a pattern that was slower and more deliberate than the corridors above, a rhythm like a slow countdown to something vast. The proportions were different from the rest of the ship, wider, taller, a space that the rest of the dreadnought had been built around rather than into. The absolute silence that filled it had nothing to do with vacuum, and everything to do with the weight of 500 years of waiting. At the center of the room was the activation node. A column of Gorvathi alloy, shoulder-high, with a socket at the top that was shaped for the trump node chip. It was smooth from a distance and intricately worked up close, covered in Gorvathi inscription that his translator rendered as a mixture of technical specification and something that in human language would have been called a dedication. The names of the people who'd built it and the promise they'd made when they'd begun. Taya walked to it. I need you on the other side of the room, she said. Taya. The activation sequence has to be input in a specific order, she said. The last input arms it to overload. That's not a metaphor. It initiates a core cascade. The ship's gone in 4 minutes from the last input. Then we input it and we run. She didn't answer. He walked around the activation column and looked at her face. The biometric lock, he said. It requires continuous contact during the sequence. She looked at him with the expression of someone who has made their calculation and is prepared to live, or not, with the result. How long is the sequence? He said. 7 minutes, she said. 7 minutes of continuous contact, 4 minutes from the last input, 3 minutes that didn't fit. He stood in the oldest room he'd ever been in a ship built by something that wasn't human, and he looked at Taya Sorn in her dead mother's coat and his borrowed jacket, and he understood something he hadn't had time to understand before, which was that some situations don't give you the ending you want, and the only question is whether you make the ending that needs to happen as well as it can be made. He thought about Clara Sorn holding a chip for 30 years, keeping a quiet life, never telling anyone. He thought about a grandmother who'd removed a key from a sleeping weapon and spent the rest of her life figuring out what to do with it. He thought about 3 generations of women carrying something too dangerous to hand to anyone and too important to let go of. He thought about a note that said, "Keep this," from the ones who look like ceremony. He'd been the one to give her the jacket. "Give me the chip," Mal said. "I told you, the biometric. Give me the chip." She handed it to him. He placed it against the node socket. The system read it, ran the biometric check and rejected it. As expected, He held it in place and spoke the sequence aloud from memory, in the exact order Taya had given him, while he kept his other hand flat against the column's surface. The sequence did nothing by itself. He hadn't expected it to. But the system's rejection protocol had a cycle to it. Each time a non-authorized key attempted the sequence, the system ran a 45-second verification before confirming the rejection. 45 seconds before it locked him out and reset. He'd need to feed it the beginning of the sequence again before the reset completed. 45 seconds over and over. "What are you doing?" Taya said. "Holding the door open," Mal said. "Get to the fold access hatch. The runner's still coupled. The station master goes first." "I'm not." "Taya," he looked at her, straight at her. "I have been doing this for 16 years. I have been in exactly 3 situations where I calculated the right answer and someone else took the cost of it instead of me. I'm very tired of that number." He paused. The words were harder than he'd expected. He wasn't built for them in the way he was built for field work, but some things you do badly rather than not at all. "I'm not asking you to give up. I'm asking you to go be alive somewhere, while I hold this door open long enough for it to matter." She stood for 3 seconds. Then she walked to him. She took his face in both her hands, not romantically, or not only that, it was the gesture of someone making sure she was seen, making sure what she was about to say landed in a person who was fully present. And she looked at him directly and she said, 4 minutes from the last sequence input. "I know," he said. "Don't let the loop run 4 times, she said. "I know," he said. She left. He stood at the core of the Onigashima dreadnought and kept speaking the sequence and resetting the protocol, and listened to the sound of Kulrak Galadra moving through the ship's levels above him, getting closer, and he thought about Veth's landing in the ash, and about Cleara Sorn holding a chip for 30 years, and about the note. "Keep this from the ones who look like ceremony." He'd spent 16 years in coalition service, most of it in places nobody officially acknowledged. He'd been good at it, not because he was exceptional, but because he was stubborn in a way that didn't announce itself and patient in a way that didn't perform itself, and he had never once in 16 years been the person a situation was actually about. He'd always been adjacent to the person a situation was about. The soldier filing the evacuation order while someone else's family got on the last shuttle. He ran the loop twice more. Then he heard Taya's voice from above, from the level above the core, from the gravity shift access, and she was not in the fold access corridor. She was not on the runner. She was 20 meters above him, and she was speaking the sequence. The biometric lock engaged immediately. It had been waiting. The system's response was immediate and total, like a door that's been open a crack suddenly swinging wide. The node slotting into recognition, the sequence taking hold, the core waking up from 500 years of dormancy with a quality that Mal could feel through the floor under his feet and the air in his lungs. He said through his teeth, "I specifically." 3 minutes from last input, she said from above. Her voice was completely steady. "We can run from here in 3 minutes. I ran the geometry. Get up here." He had a 1-second choice between the argument he deserved to make and the 3 minutes they actually had. He let go of the chip. The cascade began. He went up the gravity shift at a speed he'd never managed before, and it turned out that fold space physics worked in your favor when something was 4 minutes from catastrophic collapse, and your legs understood this better than your brain did. He came up onto the level above, and Taya grabbed his arm and they ran. The station master was at the fold access hatch, open, the runner still coupled. They went through. Shevrak was standing in the runner's main compartment when they arrived. He'd come across from the dreadnought on his own. He stood with his hands at his sides, and his expression was the one Mal had seen on level 4, the grief expression, the one that had no clean translation. He looked at them, at Taya specifically, with an attention that wasn't threat but something more complicated than that. Where's Kulrak? Taya said. Below, Shevrak said. He reached the core, a pause that had weight in it. He will not leave it. Mal understood. Kulrak had reached the core and found the cascade running and stayed, because the vow required it, because the Galadra line had promised 500 years ago, and the elder brother was the line's voice, and the line's voice didn't leave a promise to complete itself without witness. He'd stayed to watch it through, to be the person who was there when the 5-century promise was either kept or broken. Mal thought about that. He thought about it in the 3 seconds before the station master had the runner detaching, and thought about it in the 2 seconds after, and he didn't finish thinking about it. Some things you carry. The runner was 2 seconds out when the Onigashima Dreadnought's core cascade completed. It didn't explode in the conventional sense. It translated. 500 years of Gorvathi engineering, designed to open fold space like a door, turned inward and opened itself instead, and the dreadnought folded through a point no larger than the ship itself. And then it was somewhere that wasn't here, and that somewhere was not accessible to anything that remained in this space, and that amounted to the same thing as gone. The runner sat in the sudden quiet of fold space with 3 humans and 1 Gorvathi, and the complete absence of the most dangerous weapon in 5 centuries of human-alien contact. Shevrak was very still for a very long time. Then he said, in Gorvathi, which the translator rendered as something between "the debt is paid," and "it is finished," a phrase that in the full context of the Galadra Oni chain's linguistic structure apparently also carried the meaning, "my brother kept his promise." 3 translations for one phrase, which wasn't unusual for Gorvathi, whose language was built in layers like geological strata, each layer meaning something different depending on how deep you read. Nobody said anything after that for a while. Mal sat down on the runner's floor and put his back against the bulkhead and felt the specific quality of exhausted that lives just past the edge of an outcome you weren't entirely sure you'd survive. Not relief, exactly. Relief was for things you'd hoped for. This was something quieter, the physical fact of continuing, the body's assessment of its own unexpected presence. Taya sat next to him. She was still wearing his jacket. He noticed it in the way you notice things when the operational mind lets go and the rest of you catches up to the last several hours. He noticed that she'd worn it the entire time, through the colony and the relay station and the dreadnought's core, and that it was now considerably worse for wear. A burn mark along the left cuff from where she'd gotten too close to the Gorvathi bioluminescent piping on the 3rd level. A tear in the right pocket from something she hadn't told him about. Dust and mineral residue from the drainage basin worked into the fabric at the elbows. He didn't say anything about the jacket. She said, "I was going to give it back." "Keep it," he said. She looked at him. "I've got a thermal liner," he said. Something that was nearly a smile moved across her face, not all the way to actual. Just nearly the implication of a smile, the structural space where one would go, occupied not by the expression itself, but by the decision not to suppress it entirely. That distinction, he thought, was probably important. The station master from the controls said without turning, "I'm setting a course for Coalition Command Station 7. Debrief will take approximately 6 hours. Then there will be approximately 16 hours of people asking questions in rooms that smell like recycled air." "And after that," Taya said. "After that," the old woman said, "you're free, whatever that means to you." Taya was quiet for a moment. "Can we go back to Veth's landing first?" she said. The station master paused. Her hand stayed at the controls, but she was hearing the question, not just processing it. "There's nothing left there," she said. "I know," Taya said. "I want to go back anyway." Mal looked at her. She was looking at the viewport, at the fold space dark outside, which had the quality of an in-between that was going to resolve into something in a moment, a transitional state that existed only in the passage between places. She looked like someone who knew exactly where she was going, and was in no hurry to pretend otherwise. No performance of what came next. Just the honest quiet of someone who'd been running for 3 months and had come to the end of the running and wanted the first thing after it to be something real. The simplicity of it was what caught him. After 30 years of a chip passed between 3 women, after 500 years of a promise pursued by 2 brothers across human space, after all the ceremony and the doctrine and the ancient weight of vows made to the dead, after 2 brothers who'd spent their lives in service to something that had already happened, to a cost already accrued. She wanted to go back to a dead colony in the ash, just to stand in the place where her mother had stood. Just home, just that. Just the place where you started, even when starting over means starting somewhere that's already gone. The station master changed the course setting without another word. Shevrak, who had been standing at the back of the compartment, said, "The place of her ancestor." "Yes," Taya said. "That is a Gorvathi thing also," the Shevrak said, in a tone that the translator could only approximate but which landed in the room as something between recognition and mourning, the tone of someone finding a word in a foreign language that maps exactly onto something their own language doesn't have a word for. To return to the beginning after the vow is completed, to stand in the place of origin. Nobody said anything after that either. The runner moved through fold space. Outside the viewport, the dark of the in-between moved past at a speed that wasn't really speed in the conventional sense, because fold space didn't work that way, but that the human eye processed as motion because it needed to. In the ash field of Veth's Landing, 11 years after the evacuation, and 2 days after the girl had started following the soldier, a ship settled without sound in the gray morning light. After a while, its hatch opened. 2 people came out, and one of them was wearing a jacket that wasn't hers, and they stood in the ash for a while without saying anything. And the ash was the same ash it had always been, and the ghost strings of the old cultivation were still there in the soil, and the ruins held the shape of what they'd been without apologizing for being what they were now. That was enough. For some things, that's the whole story.